my name's Erin Hughes. I'm the curator at Contemporary Collaborations, and this is Josh Wright.
Hello.
And today we're going to be asking Josh a few questions about his current solo exhibition, NIMBY, with Contemporary Collaborations at Robert Young Antiques. For those that don't already know, Contemporary Collaborations is a project where we invite contemporary artists to select an object or several objects from the Robert Young Antique collection to be inspired by, to create an artwork or an installation to be displayed in the gallery window. For Josh's project, he selected a Prattware money box in the form of a little cottage, little ceramic piece. So Josh, what first attracted you to working with this object, and how did the history of this object inform the direction of your project, NIMBY?
Yeah, well, so when we first met, when I first came to Robert Young Antiques, I was in the process of doing a residency at Kettle's Yard. So outside of my sort of independent sculptural practice, I also have a practice with a close friend, Guillaume Van Dam. We work collaboratively, and we were there in Cambridge for a year. And Kettle's Yard, for those of you that don't know, is a home, is a domestic space. It is the home of Jim and Helen Eade, and it's a kind of exquisite collection of paintings of 20th century art by really, prominent names, but also furniture and natural objects. He was a big collector of shells, of pebbles. And what's really lovely about that is that he, everything was sort of displayed on an even playing field, and there's no hierarchy between the Brancusi in the corner and the pebble on the coffee table. And that was something that really struck me, and he always referred to the home as a sanctuary. And so kind of going in to Robert Young's, whilst having that experience, there are a lot of parallels between the two. I mean, obviously, Robert Young's is not a home, it's an antique shop, but certainly all of the things are designed to be, are for people's homes. But what's interesting is the way in which these very practical objects, such as oyster sticks that served a very, a purpose, have been elevated to kind of art objects and are very sculptural now. And just, Robert Young Antiques as a space is just so overwhelming. It's a real treasure trove of things. You kind of don't really know where to look. And then, so I was sort of struck by the beauty of this like very small, very delicate ceramic slip cast money box, which I think really, for me, I mean, besides it just being this very beautiful thing, spoke of universal ideals of home ownership, and this idea of kind of the quaint British cottage, which seems very far removed from my own existence living in London, and kind of far removed from where the piece now resides too, in Battersea, with all of the kind of urban regeneration around that area too.
The materials in your installation are very cohesive. I'm interested to hear more about how the Prattware money box informed these aesthetic choices. And can you also tell us a little bit about the making processes you used?
Yeah, well, I think, like with a lot of Robert's objects, the handmade, hand-painted quality of the ceramic money box was really the most important thing to me. It was, that was what I was drawn to. I mean, the object itself is a kind of mass reproduced ceramic object. It exists in many forms. It is possible to find more of these online, but what's unique is that each one is individually painted, different glazes, different outfits given to those two external figures on the outside. So that interested me, that they are all the same but different. And I can relate to that in my own work, in the sense of, I have a very handmade approach to making. And then really, I guess what interested me in the object was these ideals that I spoke of home ownership and all of that that represents. And so it felt important to talk about it in a present day context. And within that drew me to using contemporary materials. So using materials that you'd find in the new build developments, such as plasterboard, or thinking about bricks. A lot of my materials that I tend to use anyway are waste product, a byproduct of construction sites. I often kind of skip dive So, you know, and pulling out materials from construction sites. So that all kind of fed into my thinking, really. And then, so for instance, I have in the window, I have this kind of display of these like littered ersatz bricks that are precariously balanced on the structures and kind of litter the floor of the window space. And that in a way was a link for me to the power station. That certainly got me thinking about bricks as the structure itself is the largest brick structure in Europe, but also what this red brick kind of represents, which is something that feels very British and kind of has associations with kind of middle class British suburbia. And they are quite simply made with household insulation. So just, again, pieces that I've just kind of pulled out off the street or out of skips, and then cut up into these brick structures, and then they're quite simply painted with a jesmonite, which is like a kind of plaster, a strong kind of plaster resin. And then with the plasterboard, I was really interested, which fed into the book as well that I produced. But I was very interested in the language used to kind of package and market these developments. And I remembered a kind of transfer technique that I had been taught when I was like doing GCSEs or A-level at school, which was just using this sort of cellulose thinner, essentially. And what you can do is you can print like any standard inkjet or laserjet print, and then just by kind of rubbing the thinner on the back, it transfers whatever the image is or the text is onto any surface. So it was really beautiful because I was able to mimic the kind of printed texts that you get on plasterboard, but actually kind of use it in a more pointed and charged way to kind of think about this subject of housing and home ownership.
Can you tell us a bit about the title NIMBY, where you came across it?
Yes. So I think I first came across the acronym when I was watching the Jane Jacobs documentary. She was a very prolific activist, and was kind of, you know, incredibly important in preventing what was like the lower Manhattan Expressway in the 60s. And she's a prime example of a good NIMBYist. And she, you know, was able to prevent this expressway from happening, and it was which would have destroyed what is now, you know, present day Soho, Greenwich Village, and Tribeca. And that was very much pictured as a kind of David and Goliath story. And so that really interested me. But of course, NIMBY, perhaps in like a more modern day association, is as someone who is kind of against something because it inconveniences them, like they're against this housing going up because it spoils their view or destroys something that's, you know, just kind of seems a bit rudimentary, really. So I was quite interested in that duality between the two.
And researching this project by spending time walking around and looking at Battersea, in particular the power station regeneration build, which you mentioned recently in your interview with Telling Art podcast, which incidentally was recorded on the 436 bus. Can you talk a bit about how this groundwork informed your project with CC and how it ties into your upcoming walk with Dazzle Club?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you touched upon the Telling Art podcast, and what was really interesting about that was just kind of this epiphany or this realization that there was a bus that connected me directly from my studio in Lewisham all the way past, you know, places I've lived in London, past where I studied, all the way to Battersea. And so that was a really nice thing. And then it was quite a fun challenge as well to record a podcast on a bus, back when riding a bus was, you know, a thing that one could do quite comfortably before COVID. But yeah, so that was really interesting. But also, Battersea is an area that I didn't actually know that well. I've spent like 7 years living in London, but had never particularly had much of a reason to go to Battersea. So it felt really important when I was working with Robert Young Antiques and thinking about